I think what's interesting is that this is kind of the idea of like a nuke or an atomic bomb is so like embedded in like the popular consciousness that you kind of are very aware of what happened before you learn about it in school.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, obviously there's a lot of like kind of Cold War stuff that happened after what happened in Japan that kind of plays into it. But just in general, it's like when you get to, by the time you get to it in history class, it's already a story you've heard like over and over again. And it's almost like, it's hard to distinguish what you actually learned in history class and what you already knew.
The perspective was definitely flattened and did not have I don't feel like I really heard a lot of like the anti-atomic bomb. I mean, there was kind of like a general dueling sentiments, but you more often hear the argument that, you know, kind of like the bombs were justified in the sense that they ended the war and prevented more casualties. And it's kind of like swept away, almost like remarkably so, I think, in American canon. Just like it was the only times we did drop atomic bombs on another country. And it is kind of, I think, often the debate is simplified, and it doesn't really come up as much. Right. You will have like the occasional August article, right? But it definitely doesn't register the same way, perhaps naturally, than in Japan as in America. I don't think it was justified.
Okay. What about you, Ethan? Do you think you can state an opinion on this?
I mean, I don't know. Like, it's really hard to say whether, like, because when you're comparing hypotheticals, like, you really don't know what would have happened. And also when you're in war, right? It's like no matter what you do, you're gonna do evil things, right? Like murder is like unequivocally evil, right? So how can it be justified just because now you're wearing like your country's flag and you're gonna go? And it's because you're protecting your country. Like, is that really justified? No, it's still like killing someone's still evil, right? So, but when you're in a war and say you're like Truman, and you know the only options you have are evil. Like you can't like no matter what you do, you believe that like horrible things will happen and you will regret it for the rest of your life. What do you do? Like, I don't know like if anyone has a real answer to
I think the framing is trying to find some sort of like empirical moral stance on this is flawed, because I think that there is only justified, think of it like as a term, like justice, like that can only be reached in a court of law. It can be reached in place where institutions, where there's rules, where there's bases for what is right and for what is wrong. War, nothing that happens in the realm of war can really be none of it can be morally empirical. So the atomic bomb wasn't justified. The firebombing wasn't justified. The actions, none of the violent actions of the Japanese army nor the American military were justified. None of them were justified.
Yeah, but I mean, that's what I'm saying, right? Is that things can't be justified, but like, how do you
But we talk specifically about like, I think it's wrong for Americans. It makes sense, but I think it's wrong to fixate specifically on the atomic bomb as like a specific inflection point of American cruelty, because it isn't. I mean, we did it both to Japan, we did it to Berlin, we've done it to our citizens, we've done it to our neighboring countries. So it's interesting that we choose like this atomic bomb to be like, oh, was this particular thing okay? It doesn't really happen with any other debate. And I don't think we really need to have this. Like, I don't think we need there's nothing fruitful going to come from trying to find an empirical answer, I think, because it's just obvious. I think it's not morally right. But I don't think we need to dwell on the morals. We need to dwell on like, why did we get to such a machinery where the two countries were at such a scale to which they were obliterating each other's cities? But that was one of the tremendous lessons from World War II writ large was, I mean, all of Europe saw war and devastation, and there hasn't been a conflict of that scale since. So
right.
The American viewpoint, at least in the vast majority, has always been that the bombings were justified. And that's kind of an extension of the U.S. believing the entire war effort was justified, because in the United States, prior to the war, there was very little, like the population was very hesitant to join another global war. And so even though Soviet Union and Europe were, like Britain and France were begging the US to join, the most the US was willing to do was to basically send equipment. And that attitude lasted until Pearl Harbor. And once Pearl Harbor happened, everything flipped and it became, a big patriotism thing, and everyone wanted to join the military. And, like the attitude from being isolationist, which is like, something that the US has kind of gone back and forth on in its history, but at that point in time, it was very isolationist, especially after the Great Depression, and then kind of switching almost immediately. There was a feeling that since we had been attacked, that it was that it was completely justified, and anything, and then kind of going beyond that, as the war progressed, it, Americans at least had the feeling that the Japanese army was not going to give up towards the end, and then it was just the numbers calculation, right? They had a prediction of how many people would die in a land invasion, and they had and then they did the math and they compared it to how many they expected to die from the bomb, and it was just subtraction, like it's crazy. But the kind of the part where it's I think a lot of American bias can kind of come in, was that obviously the lives of American soldiers were weighted a lot higher than the lives of the Japanese mainland population. It's really hard to tell what would have actually happened if there was an invasion rather than a bomb. So it's it's like kind of a hypothetical that's probably risky to go into. But it was clear that but regardless of what would have happened, the decision made by by Truman was probably more influenced by the ability to save American soldiers' lives rather than any regard for people in Japan. Like that would have been a secondary concern.
Right.
I think.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Well. Okay. I don't know if I want to comment on something before or something now. Okay. Here's what I'll say. Oftentimes these debates do come down to a number game, and I think a lot of the ways that people talk about it, they just logically fall back on the numbers, and I mean that always immediately just flattens the dimensions of it. Something I think about is that the nuclear bombs arguably weren't even the worst things that the United States dropped on Japan during the course of the war. The series of firebombings that took place prior to the atomic bombs, I think the statistics are ridiculous. Something like 70% of Japan's urban landscape infrastructure was destroyed in World War II through firebombings. Something like Tokyo, 90% of Tokyo, each city, many of them were hit by firebombs. It's 60% gone, 70% gone, 90% gone. The lives taken in those attacks probably certainly outnumbered total mathematically everything that was happening with the nuclear bombs. I'm not sure, but
most of Japan.
I think the argument, I guess, would be that if Americans were to invade, my belief would be that more Japanese lives would be lost if American invade, only because I know that it's not the atomic bomb. It's all the other stuff that we use, and we wouldn't stop using that if we invaded. It would only be ramped up.